Hi everyone, and welcome to Politics 3520. This is our weekly, if you will, lecture. It's a kind of an odd way to do a lecture via YouTube and online like this, but hopefully it will work for you guys, and hopefully it will all make sense. Now, normally I'm running a slightly different software setup than I'm running today, so this might be a bit bumpy, a bit of a bumpy ride. I don't have the microphone I normally have, I don't have the computer I normally have for doing this, so there might be some background noise and the quality of the transmission might not be as great as I would like it to be. But I have only a very short period of time to get this done today because yesterday was beset by issues and concerns. And I'm here with you today trying to get this done during my lunch break so that you guys have some ammunition and thoughts already for your journals, which are going to be due tomorrow. So, first of all, I want to just touch on the point or the theme or the question of negative peace. And just for myself, I always find this term easier to grasp if I approach it from the perspective of trying to think about negation as opposed to negative, right? Because negative has certain connotations in our minds, whereas negation actually makes a bit more sense. Because if you think about it, the scholars that we're looking at today, all in their own way, have a theory about the causes of war, and they all lead us to think about, well, if we can just understand the causes of war and nullify those causes, then we have negated war, right? So it's peace through negation of war. And you'll see that positive peace, when we look at it later in the semester, is kind of the opposite of that. It's not peace through negation of anything, it's peace through building. What it's saying is it's not the presence of something that's the problem, it's the absence of something that's the problem. So we'll play around with these concepts a bit more as we go. But first of all, I just wanted to quickly touch on last week's journals, the feedback, give you some feedback on your Galtung writing. The first thing to say is I would please ask that people do not post their journals as attachments. It makes it harder for everyone to read, and it disrupts the flow of the journal discussion forum. I also wanted to touch on some of the key points that were raised in your journals. I wanted to mention a lot of you had talked about Anders Breivik in the Galtung journals. Austin Burns, for example, focused in on the point that Breivik was not mentally ill. A lot of you sort of jumped on this point. Brandy Leffler said it as well. So I guess you're right. You're all right that Galtung was trying to make this point and trying to say perhaps that if we reduce Breivik to simply the status of a mentally ill person without actually listening to the ideas he was espousing, it possibly leaves us at risk from those ideas down the road because we haven't spoken to them, we haven't addressed them, we haven't acknowledged them, and so there's no reason those ideas can't come back to haunt us. Another interesting point that I thought he made, which I see some of you kind of struggled with it because you were sort of saying, well, like maybe his lawyers were trying to get him off on an insanity plea, and I think Galtung is aware of that. But what's interesting as well is that even the prosecution seemed to be trying to get him on an insanity plea to a certain extent, maybe not the prosecution, but certainly members of the government and the establishment, because, in a sense, Norway prides itself on being a diverse, multicultural society and able to deal with all these sorts of diverse claims on what democracy is and what democracy should be, and so it kind of offends the Norwegian sensibilities. At least I feel like I heard Galtung speaking in these terms, that there's a kind of a way in which Breivik's mere existence as a non-mentally ill person would kind of be so paradoxical to them that they would be like, look, he has to be mentally ill because who else is going to do this? And this is what Galtung is worried about, is that we don't give the ideas a proper hearing. So just a couple of further points on that. Brandy Leffler, you said, and I quote, and I quote, even though this murder is affiliated with different social groups, that we shouldn't necessarily put him into all those groups. I wasn't sure what you meant by that. and I'd like you to clarify that for me if you can. Um, just something to watch out for, not to call you out in particular. It's not about you. Just I did notice one or two of you in your journals using sentences that didn't seem to have immediate connection to the flow of an argument. So do please read patiently and carefully everything you write before you post it. Write your journals out before you post them, and then copy and paste them in once you've proofread them and once you've read them out loud to yourself, so that you can make sure that there is a narrative flow here. Sentences like that, Brandy, seem to sort of fall back in themselves a little bit. They seem to sort of you were making some other good points there, but that sentence just doesn't seem to fit with your overall argument. I personally didn't understand it. So now a lot of you also looked at Galtung's points about the Norwegian, the question of the Norwegian armed forces being present in Afghanistan, and how there's outrage over Breivik, but there's no outrage over the Norwegian armed forces in Afghanistan. And of course, this is a very important question. It sort of goes to another point, I think, that some of you were raising, which is, where does the media really come into all this? How come our attention is attached to certain issues and problems and not others? How come, as Brandon Brooks and Alexander Kramer were putting it, how come some people are considered our others and other people are considered us, right? And the others we don't care so much about if they're dying, yet if it's one of our own, we're very much upset by it. Terrorist incidents happen all over the world frequently, but Westerners only seem to get upset about certain types of incident. Charlie Hebdo bombing in Paris is a deeply upsetting thing for people all over the world. There were hashtags "I am Charlie" or "Je suis Charlie," and you saw a lot of American media commentators, both conservative and liberal, talking about "Je suis Charlie" as the hashtag that expressed an empathy with the victims of this bombing and atrocity in Paris. Well, the same day, a good number of people died in a bomb in Lebanon, I think, and it's hard to fathom why there was no similar or comparable hashtag response at the time for those people. So we are quite selective in our outrage. It is a good point. So another point that really came through then, sort of transitioning from that, and I wanted to thank Megan Longstreth and Charlie Browning for this, as well as Alexander Kramer as well, for bringing us into sort of proximity with the part of the conversation where we're talking about Islam versus the West. And I remember reading a few years ago a book by a guy called Benjamin Barber called Jihad versus Macworld. And this book was really brilliant, it seemed to me, because it seemed to distill for us some of the points that Galtung is making here, which is, ostensibly pertain to the fact that it's not really a battle between the West and Islam. The Islamic faith has certain types of tendencies within it, which for Galtung and people like him suggest that it is community oriented, that it has a sort of a tendency to approach the question of faith through the community. Whereas in the West, because we have transitioned from being a community of faith to being individuals of faith, if you will, that's partially bound up with the Enlightenment and the separation of the church and state, and the fact that our faith needed to become a more individual, personal affair. Our relationship to God is through our heads and our hearts in the Judeo-Christian world. And so for people like Galtung, that question of our individual relationship to God, of course, absolves us of needing to think too much about the religious orientation of our community, because it doesn't matter to us as much, I suppose. And so you end up in the West having other priorities, such as the market, the priorities of the market, the priorities of the law of profit making. And so the West has transitioned into a global culture through globalization, through the globalization of the market dynamic, whereas the Islamic world hasn't. So what Benjamin Barber argues in his book, Jihad versus Macworld, and I think some of you guys were kind of touching on this point, that it's not so much the West versus Islam, but globalization versus reaction and religious reaction, because of course, even here in the West, you have older forms of Christianity, people harking back to older Christian values, which would be in some ways comparable in their communal orientation as Galtung's point about Islam is. So yeah, a lot there about global complexity. Now, Brandon asked a question, wondering if church attendance is low in the United States, and I decided to look into that a little bit because I was curious myself, and I found out that the facts seem to be unclear. According to some polls, attendance of our church-going attendance in the U.S. is quite flat, but constant at 40%. But some sociologists have done work on this, and they found out that, in fact, the polls, when you ask people whether they go to church or not, there seems to be a bit of a tendency to lie. A lot of Americans say they are regular churchgoers, whereas in fact they aren't. So once you actually look at the people who are regularly going to church, shall we say most Sundays, the numbers fall to about 20%. And I just found that really interesting. And that would be a marked decline over 30, 40 years ago. And that decline is even more stated in Europe, but certainly it's we have to acknowledge that it's going on in the U.S. as well. So a couple of other points that seem to sort of come through there. One was about global complexity and world leaders. Kayara and Kylie brought this in, and Julio, suggesting that the problems in the world today are not really because of the direct actions of anyone, and there are environmental factors, there are other factors at work today, and so the question then becomes, to what extent can we hold our world leaders responsible? How much control do they have over this bucking bronco, if you will, of global complexity? Certainly, they have some choices on the margins, and it would be appropriate, I think, to acknowledge that globalization didn't come out of nowhere. It's a project by the nation states for the nation states of the world. But once it's set in motion, of course, it achieves a life of its own, and it tells us how to live, and it tells us how to regulate our economies, and of course, in that sense, it has autonomy from us. So I'm not sure how responsible world leaders are or can be for these things, and I think Galtung was trying to sort of express that. Now, we also had some comments on the Occupy movement from Kylie, and I thought it was a decent point about the kind of fact that the Occupy movement is maybe neither left nor right, but just basically reflective of a massive dissatisfaction. And I think this dissatisfaction is clearly expressed both in the Bernie Sanders campaign and in the Donald Trump campaign, or at least rather the popular bases of support for those campaigns. Just a broad sense that the elites have really just kind of been running the show for themselves, that they've pursued globalization at the expense of any kind of corporate responsibility, that they have been lining their own pockets, getting cozy with businessmen and business corporate leaders in order to take advantage of the free money and the cushy jobs and donations to charitable bodies that are all available to them in exchange for basically doing favors for these corporate entities. So I thought Kylie was onto a decent point there with this kind of idea that a plague on all their houses. And that's what Occupy really sort of represented, as Susan Meehan and Janie North brought in this point that, in a sense that Occupy represented for Galtung America's Arab Spring. that the power was going to be rediverted, instead of being a top-down form of government, as it often typically is, more or less, in our representative democracy. Occupy was going to model for us what it means to engage in direct democracy, whereas we're not delegating the power to anyone who's then going to govern us from on high, but instead we are engaging in direct democracy from the bottom to the top. So some very good points there. Now, a couple of you brought in this sort of question or challenge of Galtung, because at some point he seems to say that America sees enemies everywhere, and I don't know that I necessarily hear him saying that in such a black and white sense. I think, yes, America sees enemies everywhere. I don't think America has enemies everywhere, but I think America is a very powerful country, if not the most powerful country in the world right now. And because its citizens are globally integrated, are integrated at least into the global economy, and realize that that's where their bread and butter lies, that's where their paychecks lie. America is ipso facto a country that is at the very helm of this process of globalization. So America brings the war to the Middle East, not on the premise of hating Muslims in any overt sense or clear-cut rhetorical sense, but it is, in a sense, recognizing that by trying to achieve something for the greater good, according to the perspective of globalization, America has engaged in the war on terror. And if I may not have explained that very well. I'm a bit tired today, but what I guess what I'm trying to say is that even though the jihads the crusades against Islam, seem like something from the Middle Ages now, it is in a sense mirrored by our own kind of crusade against Islamic fundamentalism today, because whereas those early crusades were of a religious nature, and today we don't claim to be attacking Islam or the Muslim world per se, but rather going after these so-called terrorists, it's nevertheless the case that global liberalism and global liberal commentary has sort of a notion of itself as the right way to live, right? So global liberal economic theory, which is a dominant sort of ideology of our times, sees itself as the good guy, sees itself as the good theory, and sees threats to that theory as ultimately undermining of the collective security and freedom of the planet. And so in the name of our security and in the name of our freedom, we have sort of engaged in the war on terror, because we see terrorists as evildoers who are just trying to undermine anything, as opposed to necessarily having a politics of their own, which might be somehow expressing well-founded, reasoned, thoughtful criticisms of globalization and the way social life is reproducing itself under globalization. The secularity, the consumerism, these are things that are presumed to be good within globalization. But I think if we listen to people a little more carefully, we find out that the good at heart that global liberalism and American liberalism seems to have at the core of its plan for the world seems to be part of the problem. And we have a self-fulfilling prophecy then, insofar as global liberalism advances itself as the solution to our insecurities in the world and the thing that's going to bind us all together, and people challenge it and reject it, sometimes through terrorism, we suddenly start to see the enemies of globalization as a need for more globalization, as sort of these enemies, that their mere existence seems to be the occasion for further globalization, further global securitization, as the solution. So, sorry if I've explained that a little bit backwards, but I'm trying to sort of get into the idea that that by sort of offering the world um, both the opportunity for freedom in globalization and security from the ne'er-do-wells who would seek to undermine globalization, um, America has sort of developed a kind of amnesia that not everyone in the world may, by definition, want to live that way. And so there's a self-fulfilling prophecy in there insofar as the enemies that emerge to reject globalization seem to be people that need to be dealt with as sort of almost irrational, and hence we will step up and militarize in response to them as opposed to deal with them and in a sort of a more relational way, in a more dialogic way. So yeah, it's an interesting point. I'm glad you guys liked that video anyway. I certainly did. I think it's brilliant, and I hopefully will get a chance to watch more videos later in the semester. So moving on, I just wanted to give some quick tips on checking in on some of our readings this week on negative peace. So I only have very little time left, so I'm going to move through these all too quickly because I need to get this uploaded for you guys today. One really cool episode of Mad Men, episode 1 of season 1 of Mad Men, brought in this Freudian notion that we were reading about this week, which is this notion of the death drive. And it's a really fascinating idea. This is, of course, referring to Freud's letter to Albert Einstein, which we read for this week. And it discusses a number of different things, but principally it's talking about the alloyed nature of the death instinct, right? That is, we human beings have a kind of a destructive impulse, and they also have a sexual or a constructive impulse as well. An impulse for union, an impulse for togetherness and community. And what Don Draper in this very comical scene is doing is kind of talking in the 1950s to cigarette executives. And these executives are fearful because the government has told them that the jury is now in, cigarettes are bad for you, and we're going to start putting advisories on cigarette cartons to advise people not to buy them because they cause cancer. And the cigarette companies are going like, who the hell's going to buy these things now? Because basically they're not healthy anymore. And Don goes, look, no problem, don't worry about it, right? I've read Freud, and what Freud says, of course, is that both eros, the instinct of union, and the destructive instinct, the death drive, contain within themselves elements of each other, right? So we understand that in the same breath, while human beings have a civilizing impulse, they want to live in an ordered society, they want to remove nature and disorder from their midst. In the same breath, at that moment when we're sitting in our office block, 20 floors up, you can feel a little overcome by civilization, and you may want to step outside to take a step back from it all. And of course, at that moment, the cigarette becomes symbolic, right? Because the cigarette, while it's not nature, the cigarette is emblematic of the danger of life, right? The danger of living. And of course, it's bad for you, but you're going to buy a cigarette anyway because you've never felt more alive than when you were sort of staring death in the face, right? So this idea of the seduction of death, because even though death is something we've tried to escape for hundreds of years, I think what Freud is saying and what Donald Draper is saying in this episode of Mad Men is that there's a kind of an erotic impulse in death, right? That there's a sense in which we have a greater and more acute feeling of being alive than in a time of crisis, in a time of danger, or in a time of military combat, as Freud is arguing, than we do in our regular TikTok humdrum lives. So it's this, and this is of course something Chris Hedges is talking about as well. And this is why Freud is saying, that, yeah, sure, we can all talk about building a society based on love, are building a society based on some what he calls common values of identification. But those ideas are going to be a long haul for us as a species, because we're just not really enlightened enough yet to avoid the seductions of war. War is deep in our soul. Now, if Freud has a kind of a genetic or biological sense of the causes of war, Margaret Mead is rejecting this idea completely. Mead was an anthropologist, of course. Interestingly, in his little chat, Freud is telling us that he's heard of existence of these so-called happy folk, and as I'm reading it, I'm thinking like little hobbits from the Lord of the Rings or something. But Freud doubts the existence of these happy folk, these placid human beings who never go to war. He's heard of them, but he doesn't really believe they exist. Whereas Margaret Reed, as an anthropologist, has studied this stuff. She knows her shit, and so she can really sort of bring some serious knowledge to bear. And she notes that there's a lot of people in the world, a lot of peoples rather, who don't have war in their vocabulary, who don't have war in their intellect. And so as a result, there's no war. And it's not just that these people are pacifistic either. The Eskimos, as she says in the quote here, are not a mild and meek people. Many of them are turbulent and troublesome, but there is no war in their communities. So we have to ask this question, like, if Eskimos can be so rough and tumble, well, why is there no concept of war? They seem like they might be ripe for the war condition, for being warlike, but they aren't. So why is that? What does it mean to say that war is an idea that warlike peoples have invented? I think simply she's saying, and she uses some sort of references to various sort of legal institutions, like the trial by combat, for example. The trial by combat idea, of course, is a thing of the past. And it's a thing of the past not because it was offensive to anyone. It's a thing of the past because we found better, more efficient ways to resolve our issues. So we've put the sort of pistols at dawn kind of notion to bed. No one challenges each other to a duel anymore. If you've offended my honor, I might write a blog piece against you, or I might sue you for slander or whatever. But I'm not going to challenge you to pistols at dawn. So what she's arguing is that we need new concepts, new ideas to come along for war, just as we have alternative means of resolving our disputes without going to trial by fire these days. Now, Chris Hedges, interesting guy, also someone who's very much interested in the erotic aspect of life in war. He talks about war as culture, how wars can be deep in our culture, how wars can be mythic, and how wars also, in a sense, are crusading. And the war on terror, of course, is a case of all three. What is central to Chris Hedges' argument is the idea, and I quote, that war is sometimes the most powerful way in human society to achieve meaning. War is a force, as he argues, that gives us meaning. And so how is that? Why does war give us meaning? And I think in a sense it's going back to this erotic aspect of that Freud is referring to. What Chris Hedges is bringing to the table that Freud isn't is knowledge of the contemporary and the war on terror. So he's kind of updating Freud for today's context and asking the question in relation to the war on terror. With the crazy technologies that we have today, is it not reasonable to ask, he is suggesting, that whether, we are running out of time. I think, that war needs to be dealt with now more than ever before, because the technologies are making war quite difficult to live with, and maybe even giving us reason for, concern as to whether the species would survive another major war. Minutes left here. Again, I'm sorry, this is kind of a short lecture. Please, I do apologize for the technical error yesterday. But Just a couple of sort of key points. We're just going to do a one-pager here on the Glenn Greenwald text. I hope you enjoyed reading it. I'm really fascinated by his arguments and his observations. He's one of the most astute and shrewd commentators on this issue of how modern technologies are changing our prospects for peace. And that's why this book is part of our supplemental readings for this course, because all of those readings, in a sense, are giving us what the mainstream debates and literatures on peace studies can't really give us insights into, which is, the technological and sociological phenomena that are ongoing. I think Glenn Greenwald is under no doubt that because the internet is not just any old technology, that even the founding fathers, who of course wrote the Bill of Rights as an amendment containing a series of amendments to the U.S. Constitution around about the time that the Constitution was written, even though they were wise enough to include in that a prohibition of unreasonable searches and seizures, it is the case that that right was written for a time when people were circulating letters and perhaps telegrams, and the government has always kind of taken a slightly relaxed view on how that right pertains to non-physical communications, like a telegram, like a radio transmission, like a phone call, but these things have always been part of a dialogue back and forth among different scholars of jurisprudence. What Greenwald is sort of putting out there, though, is because we relate to the internet as a media differently than any other media we've ever used as a species in history, that the stakes are higher when we talk about surveillance today. The stakes are much higher. Greenwald, I think, goes past the founding fathers of the United States, whose interest in defending our privacy was one of a simple ethics. Remember, they were writing in a time where the British government had been subjecting them to, warrantless surveillance and search in a time of war. And in the name of a regime that was trying to extract taxes without representation. So I think, the founding fathers clearly sort of understood that part of the problem was that Britain was ruled by a monarchy, and that it was not itself a republic, and that because it was not itself a republic, it did not know how to control its warlike nature. It did not how to control its tendencies to violate the dignity and rights of its subjects. Whereas the promise of the American Republic for people like Thomas Paine, for people like Jefferson, the promise of a republic is that it would transcend these corrupt, vulgar tendencies, and that it would dignify its citizens with this capacity to be able to communicate in private without government surveillance. And in that, of course, is the kernel of Republican democracy. Republican, not in the sense of the Republican Party, by the way, but I mean like the Republican theoretics of people like Thomas Jefferson. They wanted to establish a republic because in a republic no one is beyond the law. There is no king. Everyone is equally subject to the law, and everyone must pay for their crimes, no matter whether they're the president or a member of the elite society or a poor man. Everyone has to be held accountable for the crimes they might commit. So the founding fathers would have approached the surveillance of communication technologies through that lens, right? Through a lens of sort of the rights and obligations and duties of citizenship in a Republican democracy. But Greenwald, I think, is going even further than that. and it is. I think that he almost sees the internet more in anthropological terms, and by that I mean, and he says it in the book, um, that the internet isn't just a way we exchange messages; it's a place. You can call it a virtual reality, whatever you want to call it, but it has more in common with the agora of ancient Greece than it does the post office, right? The post office is where we go to send parcels and letters. And certainly there's a virtual aspect to the post office and the mail system, but it's a very, very slow one, and it's not real time, whereas the internet is, and the amount of video and sort of the way we can sort of symbolically represent ourselves on the internet makes it a different kind of a place. It has an anthropological significance that the postal system just doesn't have. So it is it is a type of media that, in a sense, while literacy and the spreading of the printing press had anthropological significance, to be sure, I think that the internet, definitely has even more so because it's so um, multivalent. By that I mean that it has a number of different voices going at the same time, and you can be yourself. You can perform yourself. You can, give evidence of yourself, of who you are through the internet in a way that you simply can't to a diverse public. Say in social media and Twitter, Facebook, these things are just simply uncountenanceable through the postal system. Um, so that, I think, is at the core of Edward Snowden's complaint, and I have here on the slide a little reference to Edward Snowden's movie. I'll post a link for you guys because I think it's streaming in a number of places for free. If you're interested in taking this idea further, you should definitely watch Edward Snowden's movie, Citizen4, made by Laura Poitras and, of course, our own Glenn Greenwald here that we're reading this week. It's a great documentary because Edward Snowden gets into some of these issues and talks about how, with the internet being so ubiquitous, and a direct sort of reflection of who we are, that once the internet is kind of cracked down upon, it doesn't just sort of mean we won't write certain things, right? I won't just put a certain letter in the mail, because the internet knows everything about me. I'm being tracked on there all the time, by Amazon, by other search engines. Amazon tries to tell me what it thinks I need to know about based on what I've searched for previously. And so I know now how the internet works by being on Amazon, and I know what government surveillance is going to look like. If Amazon knows what I'm doing, the federal government will know what I'm doing this in the same breath, in the same way. So I'm going to start watching what I click. And this sort of allows you to sort of get to a point here that, recently we've seen a lot of states legalizing marijuana. And the only way you can have legalization of marijuana is through the freedom of conscience and the freedom of speech to be able to express views in this, and over time to build legitimacy for the purpose of legalizing marijuana. Ask yourself, when you're afraid to click on something on Amazon because it looks like something that you don't want the government to know that you're interested in, then you're going to find people are going to self-control a lot more. They're going to self-censor a lot more. They're going to hunker down and hide away from the parts of the internet that they feel they shouldn't, the illicit parts of the internet where they can find knowledge about things that maybe they shouldn't be knowing about according to their own internalized version of the government. So, the advent of internet surveillance is relevant for our conversation about peace studies, I think, because it indicates the way in which technology is changing and the way in which that active and vibrant citizenry that is desired by people like Galtung is going to be hunkering down and hiding away from itself, self-controlling, self-disciplining, all in a manner of trying to sort of be able to get by in the space of the internet a little better, a little more compliantly with the desires of the powers that be, or their interpretation of what it is the powers that be want from them. So I think it's a fascinating text. It's a fascinating text about how we are militarizing the internet, how we are securitizing the internet. I think it also speaks volumes to Chris Hedges' notion of the erotic nature of war, and how, in a sense, we are all the willing partners of this project of mass surveillance. Because even though we know through WikiLeaks and things like this that this government surveillance is ongoing, we continue to participate and continue to vote in a manner which does little or nothing about it. And of course, the mainstream media, as Glenn Greenwald argues later in the book, is not very helpful with this. And he asks the question, like, why are the mainstream journalists not going after this? And possibly it's to do with some of the things we've been talking about today, that they just don't see because of the erotic nature of securitization. And I'm coming back to this for a reason. We are kind of enthralled and fascinated and motivated by this sort of gloriousness of the war on terror, the spectacle of the war on terror, and I'm just wondering if that's possibly one of the reasons why the mainstream media won't really do anything about reporting on the type of things that Glenn Greenwald is talking about. So there you go, folks. Sorry that was very, very short. I hope in next week we'll have this software problem a little bit more resolved, and we can have a slightly longer lecture. But thank you for your patience and your time the last 24 hours or so. I appreciate it.